Welcome back to the Bible in Context,
where context is king and the original author's intent drives our interpretation.
I'm Caleb.
And I'm Nate.
And today we have a special guest with us, Dr. Ryan Mullins, and going to be discussing a little bit about, we stay in the biblical theology lane. We stick strictly to the text. And so I think Dr. Mullins here has done a really good job from what I've read of his work of kind of marrying theology proper and philosophy back to a biblical worldview. And so I wanted to have a chance to discuss a few big items within theology proper and see how he handles those issues and how they relate to the biblical text. And so, Dr. RT Mullins, thank you for coming on. Tell us a little bit about yourself and your work and what brought you to this point in your scholarship.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I am currently a lecturer in philosophy and theology at the University of Lucerne. So I'm running an online master's program in philosophy, theology, and religions. So it's looking at all the Abrahamic religions. And then I'm also a docent of dogmatics at the University of Helsinki in Finland. What
is that?
Yeah, so I don't entirely understand this. So when you do, in the German academic system, you do your PhD, and then if you want to become a professor, you have to do a second PhD.
Okay.
And so you do this thing called the doctoral habilitation. And so I did my habilitation in Helsinki during my time when I was at the Collegium for Advanced Studies, which sounds like it's like an evil organization, but it's actually a paradise for academics because you get to just, here's your office, do your research. It was pretty great.
Nice.
And so when you get wherever you get your habilitation, they give you this title of docent or professor. So you're a titular professor, which means they don't pay you, but you have the right to have access to all the library stuff. You can supervise PhD students. If they need somebody to teach, they're like, hey, you could do this. And they can give you money then. But yeah, this is kind of what it means to be a docent of dogmatics, is you are recognized as an expert and we will call upon you if needed.
So you get a title, but you just don't get a paycheck.
Yes. At some point in your academic career, you just start collecting titles. And yeah, I don't remember how many titles I have at this point. But paycheck, that's another issue, but we don't have to go into that. So most of my work has been on looking at different models of God and trying to figure out what all the models of God are and then arguments for and against them. That way, hopefully I can figure out which one I think fits best with Scripture, with Christianity. That's what I'm hoping to figure out. We'll see if I actually pull that off.
I like how you tackle these issues because listening to, I think, your most recent book, I listened to a couple of your books recently, and you go through and you argue for the case that you don't agree with a lot. I think you argued for Calvinism, Molinism, and open theism. You argued all of those cases to their greatest extent and then began to eliminate different options based on what you saw fit with within each camp. And I really like your tact with that. I know your podcast, The Reluctant Theologian, you keep a quite sarcastic tone, which I think is entertaining. But your books, you're also a lot more humble and honest with how you handle these different theological camps rather than pitting them against each other and seeing everything as that's not your view as an enemy. So I really appreciate that tact.
It's what I try to do. Not everybody appreciates it, but yeah, because the show it needs to be sarcastic. It needs to be funny because otherwise people are going to fall asleep. Because I have a voice that I could do nighttime ASMR stuff or something to help people fall asleep, but no, you don't want people falling asleep during your show. But yeah, in the writings I try really hard to go, here's as much as I can because to defend a view, because what I would like to see is genuine healthy debates over these different rival views on God, whereas a lot of the stuff I see is not good, it's not healthy, and a lot of the arguments are terrible, and I'm not interested in terrible arguments anymore. I'm getting too old for this, and I'm losing my patience here, so I want to figure out what the real problems are.
This is interesting. So to do some research on you, I cheated and used Chat GTP or GPT. And at first, when I was asking it questions, it was a little bit confused on some of your views it seemed like you're contradicting each other. And so, but the more I asked questions, the more it would nuance what you actually believed. And so it was really interesting. At first, I thought, what does he actually believe? But I think it's probably because of the way that you handle the arguments and you really try to show both sides of it. I love it.
Yeah.
I was actually one of the first episodes that I think I stumbled upon. Well, not one of the first, but I came across it's kind of recent episode on open theism in historical theology. And so that one at first threw me for a loop. Because wait a minute, is he an open theist or is he not? And so, because I don't think he stated explicitly, but really good information. And But I was just, it took me a second to wait a minute. Okay, let me go read this. Here's what he kind of thinks on this issue. So, yeah, it's fun. I like the way that you handle those things. One of the first things we want to talk about here is you talk about classical theism a lot, and again, where you both may agree and diverge from that. And one thing that you spend a lot of time on is divine impassibility. So, first of all, that's a $10 word. So let's talk about, just tell us what divine impassibility is, and then let's talk about maybe some biblical support or things that maybe go against it, and just work our way through that topic. So what is that?
Yeah, so I should start with this caveat before I define it. Every view affirms that God has emotions, which is surprising because sometimes the way we talk about impassibility in 20th century and early 21st century theology is God either has emotions or he doesn't. And I'm like, well, that's not quite right. And I can explain why later. The debate is over which emotions God has and a few other like kind of related issues. So here's what impassibility says. It says God can have any emotion that is perfectly moral and perfectly rational, because you don't want God having irrational emotions. Like, that's terrible. And you really don't want like a deity that's got like all these like lusty and sinful emotions. Like that's gross. You don't want that. So impassibility is like, yeah, we get rid of that. But everybody else agrees too, though. So that's not interesting. It's not unique. Impassibility adds this other claim, though. They say that God cannot have any emotion that's inconsistent with his perfect happiness. And you're like, whoa, okay, what's going on there? So God's in a state of pure, undisturbed bliss that is grounded entirely in himself. Why? Here's why. Because impassibility also wants to say it is impossible, in the strongest sense of impossible. It is impossible for God to have any emotions or beliefs or actions that are influenced or moved or based upon anything outside of himself. So let me say that again because it's really strong and it might not sink in. So God cannot be moved or influenced by anything outside of himself for his beliefs, his emotions, and his actions. So when I said God's perfectly happy and it's just grounded in himself, well, that's the only way it could be. Because if God were happy about something about you, well, then his emotions would be based on you. If God acted because of something about you, well, then his actions, his beliefs are based on you and responding to you. That's not how this is supposed to work, given impassibility.
And in your readings, you've taken a few issues with that particular aspect of that doctrine, and it just kind of goes along with what Nate and I talked about. I think as we've gone through our Genesis series, we talk about one big one is Genesis 22 that comes up, where God has a genuine interaction and reaction to Abraham's passing the test, doing what he is asked to do. And so how I think I was even raised up to look at that is, well, this is all just kind of a metaphor for Abraham's benefit, not so much anything about God actually changing or thinking or doing anything. It's all about for our benefit. And so, I want to walk through a couple of verses that maybe sound like they support this idea and see if you have anything you would add to that or take away. And then maybe talk about, again, what are some problems, and again, just go how into this impacts larger theology and philosophical topics and so on. I think one that often comes to mind is probably places like Malachi 3:6. And it says, "For I, Yahweh, do not change. Therefore you, O children of Jacob, are not consumed." So the big punchline here is it says God does not change. Yahweh does not change. This is a sample of the verses that we see that, God must not have any kind of change. Is that what this is talking about?
Right. So you see similar kind of verses in like Numbers and in 1 Samuel. And what's interesting is when you look at all of these passages, they give you a really specific context in which God does not change. God is not a liar, is what it says. And you're like, why is that relevant? Well, here's why it's relevant. Because the whole context is, God, you made a promise. Like, where are you? What are you doing here? Like, this is a common theme throughout like a lot of the Old Testament. Is like, God, you made a promise. Like, you better stick to it. And God's like, yeah. No, I'm not a man like you who, like, when I say I'm going to do something, I'm just lying. I'm not like that. When I make a promise, I'm going to stick with it. And so this is a kind of covenantal faithfulness that's really interesting to see play out in all the drama of the entire Old Testament narrative. And so when you come to something like Malachi, that's like what Malachi's really upset about. He's like, God, you made a promise to Israel. What are you doing here? Where are you? And God's like, no, I assure you, I am not a man who is double-minded. I'm not going to lie to you. I'm going to keep my promises. Now, this whole context here assumes certain kinds of changes, because there's a change from you haven't made a promise, and then now you made a promise. Because when you make a promise, you acquire certain obligations. And so the entire narrative of God freely entering into a covenant is a change, because God wasn't doing it, now he's doing it. And then now God has acquired certain obligations, a special relationship to the Hebrew people that he didn't have before. So it's now that you've changed in these certain ways. Now you're going to make sure that you stick with this plan, is how this is going.
And it's that same non-changing covenant faithfulness that we see in places like Psalm 102. And I think that James 1:17, that's just an interesting one because you've transitioned a bit in your context. And so James 1:17 is talking about, it says, every good gift and every perfect gift is from above, coming down from the Father of lights, with whom there is no variation or shadow due to change. And I feel like this one sounds, at least when you're first reading it, a lot more concrete and maybe more using more philosophical language or metaphorical language that can be applied in multiple ways, including a philosophical way. And so, I mean, this one here, he's talking about, though, that God has brought us forth by his word, by knowing the truth. And so he's not going to change from being, in the context of James, from being someone who is delivering into a tempter, actually trying to make you fall back out of faith. So a lot of these that are used to prop up this idea, it seems like that God does not change. Like you said, they have a very specific context. It's not just an absolute statement about no change whatsoever. God is a monolith kind of thing.
Right. So I think this is what's important to keep in mind when you're looking at different biblical passages, is when I make the statement like, well, that guy over there, he's not changing. Like, you know, he's a good, faithful person. Like, this is a common way of talking in everyday discourse. Like, and what I mean by that is, well, like, this guy over here, like, he's a good guy. Like, you know, you don't have to worry about this or that. He's trustworthy. He's, you know, when he says he's going to do something, he's going to do it. Do I mean to say that, like, this person cannot change in any way, shape, or form? Like, that's a really strong statement. And I can make that statement because I know how to use the English language. But, you know, like, I just don't think that's what's going on when you're looking at a lot of these passages. And I don't think it could even get there, because the entire context here is God did something in the past, and he's doing stuff right now, and he's going to stick with that in the future.
I feel like I see the tendency to, and I'd like your comments on this, whenever you say something about human versus saying it about God, you must mean it to its greatest extent, just by nature of the statement being about God. And so to say that a man is unchanging, you know, well, he's true to his word, he's, you know, consistent. To say God is unchanging, no, this isn't just about a particular aspect of his character being unchanging or something like that. You must mean it to its greatest extent, which means every way that I think that unchangingness can be perfected. That seems to be a general term.
It is. So this is what's weird about... So my boss at Lucerne, Giovanni Ventimiglia, he says a lot of times theologians, they treat God like he's the moon. Here's what he means. So when you're trying to figure out stuff on Earth, you're like, well, you know, we've got these certain effects of gravity. We've got to deal with these kind of, like, natural laws. And, you know, this is how things work on Earth. When it comes to God, well, it's all completely different as soon as you get into outer space, you know? And he's like, it seems like this is what they're doing. They're trying to be astronauts, and they're trying to say God's like the moon, and all the rules are just off. But it's not quite right, because the rules are not entirely off. So here's like a common claim that you kind of alluded to. When I make a statement that's true about you and true about God, I really mean something kind of different in each case. So if I say God is wise and Socrates is wise, I'm somehow speaking in some sort of analogical way. Because, and I'm like, why? I thought it was being pretty clear, straightforward. Well, because when you said God is wise, what you really meant to say is that God is perfectly wise, or God is identical to wisdom. And I'm like, that's what I meant to say? I didn't realize that. You're putting words in my mouth. No,
I don't know
when I said
that either, or knew that they meant that.
Right, exactly. And so this is what I think is interesting. So you see this in Aquinas' doctrine of analogy, where it's like, well, when we say these things, here's what we really mean. And I'm like, you speak for yourself. Like, if I wanted to say God is perfectly wise, I would say that. If I wanted to say God is identical to wisdom, I would say that. And I know Aquinas knows how to say those things, because he does say those things. Whereas when I look at the biblical authors, they seem like they're competent language users. They seem like they have a full grasp of when to speak very literally, when to use idioms, when to use like interesting phrases that their audience is going to understand. They know how to use language. So if they wanted to make stronger claims, in a bunch of cases I think they could have.
Yeah, absolutely. They are, and I mean, I think you've interacted quite a bit with Drew Johnson, and he shows how like they are doing their own brand of philosophy. It's not what we recognize, because we are used to, you know, reading Socrates and Plato, and that's our version of philosophy, so therefore the Bible can't be that. But they're intelligent. They're doing a lot of heavy lifting philosophically, theologically. So they have the means to do that, but they choose to still portray God in the way they do. And maybe they meant to do that for a particular reason.
I think so. So let me give you one quick example of this. So when you're looking at the like first Enoch, second Enoch, like this intertestamental like biblical literature, which is some wild stuff. So that's always a fun read anyway, just by itself.
Oh yeah.
When you're looking at some of that, there's the convention of how you talk about God as timeless, as like this in this sort of timeless present. You can find that in some of the intertestamental literature, but you don't find that in the Old Testament or the New Testament. And what you see in whoever wrote Revelation, like say it was John, like he completely goes against that convention. Instead of talking about God in this timeless is, just existing, he says the one who was, is, and is to come. And he says it continually. And it's a very clear rejection of this convention of how to talk about a timeless God, which I think is interesting, and I think it's intentional, because one of the things that Revelation is trying to get across is this is the God who existed in the past. He has a history. Knowing that history is really important. And he's the God who's with us right now. And he's the God who is going to come back and make good on these promises. So this is a very different view from this God who is in a timeless present that's just blissfully static and statically blissful.
Yeah. Well, actually, so that's going to be the second part of our discussion. Is going to be talking about God and time a little bit, and so I do want to come back to that particularly. That's really cool. So we have gone through a few things that kind of, well, they've been used as support for divine impassibility, for the unchangingness of God in every way, and shown how they don't quite mean what we may take them to mean. We can't push them to their greatest extent in what we consider to be perfect unchangingness. So are there any places where we see both in the biblical text and in just kind of how this marries into other philosophical topics that are not jiving with this idea of divine impassibility?
Mm-hmm. I think the entire biblical narrative is one where God is acting on behalf of his people. So something about his creatures is a motive for God to act. And so that already goes against impassibility. Because remember, impassibility says God cannot be moved or influenced for his beliefs, his emotions, or his actions. So anytime you come across a text where it's like God responds or does something because of a creature, well, that's going to go against impassibility. Here, there's a bunch of these, but let's just focus on, I'll just give you one. So in the Old Testament, over 400 times God's anger or his wrath is talked about. And so that's a lot. I'm not going to go through all 400. I'll just give you one verse. So it's Psalm. We have time. We just go through all 400. So Psalm 7 verse 11. So Psalm 7 verse 11 says, "God is a righteous judge and a God who feels indignation every day." Now it's in the midst of poetry, right? So you want to be careful, not taking things too literally when you're reading poetry. But what a lot of Old Testament scholars, like Terence Fretheim, will point out is these literary devices, metaphor, poetry, so on, they're always pointing towards some literal reality. So you want to see what it's pointing towards. If the metaphor is pointing towards something that just completely contradicts, that doesn't make any sense. So here's what you need to ask yourself: is God ever get angry? Because this metaphor feels indignation every day. I don't think it's a metaphor. But it's a poetic expression. Maybe it's hyperbole or something. So it at least strongly suggests God sometimes gets angry. Whereas if you affirm impassibility, God's in a state of pure, undisturbed bliss or happiness that cannot be disturbed by anything, and it can't be based on anything outside of himself.
Well, if he was unchanging and this verse was true, then wouldn't he be eternally angry as well? I mean,
this is one way you can develop the argument. Yeah, is be God's eternally pissed off and eternally happy, and you're like, what is it? And then at the same time, and then you get to heaven, you get this other problem. So you get to heaven, and you're just like, oh man, this is great. This is what I've been waiting for. And oh God, I'm so excited. And he's like, yeah, I'm still really angry about all that stuff in the past, though, because I can't change my and you're like, oh, bit of a party pooper, aren't you, God? This, you don't want this either. These are some problems you could run into.
Right, yeah, and especially when you're talking just popularly to, just fellow church members, we've all kind of developed these ideas in different ways or heard a nuance of it over here and carried it to the way that we think about it as individuals. And so you get, I feel like, just over the course of my life, gotten every flavor of this idea, just from people thinking through it by themselves and reaching conclusions, whether they're good or bad. They've reached conclusions, and some of them are damaging. So it's good to explore some of these Like, what about this over here? Is God always just mad at me for all eternity? Is he still mad after the second coming and, everything's great now, but he's still dwelling on my sin or someone else's? And for some, that can be crushing. And so, again, I think this is just some of the practical implications we can pull out of this.
It
Well,
is.
yeah,
Go ahead, Nate. Yeah, what are you
I'd
thinking?
like to ask a question about that. Just what do you guys think about how does this impact just your everyday Christian at church? I mean, what are some of the, I guess, some of the bad theology that's kind of leaked down into our churches because of this?
So there's a couple different ways it could go. So let me start with what I think is an important New Testament theme. You were once a child of wrath, and now you're like a child of God's forgiveness. And you're like, whoa, okay, is that true? Well, if God's impassible, I don't know how he could ever be angry at you. Or maybe he's just like eternally angry at you, like unchangingly angry at you. That kind of sucks. So you're not going to get to switch to the forgiveness part. So that's pretty bad. It makes like the New Testament like incoherent. And so if it's incoherent, then it's not possibly true. That kind of like has a hard impact on your faith if it turns out all your beliefs are just nonsense. Here's some other areas where I think this really impacts. A lot of people want to know that something at the heart of the universe, something at the heart of reality actually cares about me. Like, I want to know that God cares about me. And if I'm looking at a being that cannot be moved or influenced by anything outside of himself, you have to ask a very important question. What could this being care about? Aristotle gives a very clear answer to this. Aristotle says God knows all the necessary truths, knows himself, knows like, man, I'm just so amazing. But does he know any contingent truths like you exist or what's going on here? No. Aristotle's like, God cannot know that. What a lot of Christian theologians have done, though, is they try to take that Aristotelian idea and like slam it together with the Bible. And Arthur Lovejoy says you just create this monstrosity, like these two like completely different concepts of God just thrown together. And I think that can cause lots of cognitive dissonance, and it can make people really doubt, could God actually care about me? Right. So when I was first writing this, an earlier book called God and Emotion, I was living in England, and church attendance there is like nothing. It's changing a bit now. There's been some reports recently where things have changed, but that's just of 2025. So when I was writing this, it was mainly atheists and agnostics, and I'm looking at like these different views about God and emotion, and they got so animated. They're so animated. Like, you've got to tell people that impassibility is wrong. I'm like, why? Why do you care? You don't believe that God exists, and they're like, but it just can't be. It can't be that God has no cares or concerns about us. It can't be that it's just impossible for this. I'm like, well, people who affirm impassibility will try to give you a story of how God cares about you. You're like, that doesn't make sense. And I'm like, why do you care? And again, it comes back to that point I made earlier. Everyone wants to know that something in reality, something at the heart of reality actually cares about them. It's a deep human need. Yeah.
Yeah, and I feel like this will get into some of our time discussion as well, but like I've thought about, this may not be a great metaphor, so correct me if this is ridiculous, but if you get this idea of a completely unchanging God, nothing affects him outside of himself, but yet we are here in time, moving, changing, we want God to care for us, but God is almost like this radioactive rock that does not move or change, and we radiate out from him, and that's how the world comes to existence. We're just kind of a byproduct of him, that we can't actually change anything about him. He feels nothing for us, or he's eternally, unchangeably happy, but then the good and bad in our life, there's no variation in that. So again, it just turns God into this static rock that things emanate from him, but we have no relationship with that. But that's not how the Bible depicts it. We have an intimate relationship, and he cares, and he changed enough to become a human and come for us and live in flesh.
Yes. So what you laid out sounds a lot like Plotinus's view of the one, of God. Whereas like this thing that's beyond all knowing, we can't describe it, but let me write 200 pages describing what it's like. We ignore that contradiction. And everything just emanates without reason. Like, God's not acting for a reason. Plotinus is very clear on this. And so everything just kind of emanates, and we're supposed to somehow contemplate and find all our joy in the one. But you're like, how's this supposed to work? And I don't think it does. And I think it's a very different picture from a God who's perfectly rational, who decides to create the universe for a reason and wants to accomplish whatever that reason is. As I read the Bible, I think a major theme, not the only theme, but a major reason for why God would create is to enter into friendship with humanity. And so this is a God acting on the basis for a reason, wants to accomplish a particular goal, and this is a world where actions have consequences. So if God performs an action, there are consequences for that. God takes on certain responsibilities. God is going to be focused on achieving these goals of entering into friendship with humanity. It's a very different picture of God. It really is.
Yeah, absolutely. And I feel like, again, that's just some of the, you mentioned just agnostic atheist pushback. I feel like that thinking through that is one lackluster understanding of philosophy, but also married with just popular philosophy that you find, especially in atheistic groups. And that this is kind of the direction they go. That combined with the problem of evil, and it's just, well, okay, God is a supercomputer, and I can't explain evil, but I think that this is one of the key steps, like you mentioned, that can help people with their faith a lot, understanding like, no, God actually does feel and care about his people.
It can help. So something for me when I was working through a lot of these big philosophical ideas is coming to realize, how do we actually get to know someone well? Like, how do you really enter into a close personal relationship with someone? And empathy is part of that. It's not the only thing, but it's part of it. So if I want to really get to know either of you, I need to start thinking about, what is it actually like to be Caleb? Or what is it like to be Nate? And try to put myself in your shoes. And the process of doing that, I learn a lot. And I start reflecting on myself as well. And what I realized is, you have to do the same thing with God. Like, and this is something you see, I think, in Hosea. The book of Hosea, like, this is where God comes to the prophet, and he's like, I want you to understand exactly what I'm going through right here. Like, I want you to marry someone who's deeply unfaithful, because this is how I'm feeling with Israel right now. So God is inviting the prophet to enter into this really radical sense of empathy with God in order to help him understand what God is like. And one of the things you discover through that process, in the book of Hosea at least, is this is a God of really deep compassion. A God who's deeply hurt, but a God whose compassion is going to win out over his anger. And what you see in Hosea, quite explicitly, is God says, I will change, because I'm not a stubborn man who lacks compassion.
Yeah.
Okay. And so inviting people to empathize with God, I think that it's a different way of looking at our spiritual practice that we're not used to. But I think it's a biblically grounded spiritual practice, and it's something worth pursuing.
Absolutely. And I think we're about to go into a series on the minor prophets, and you just see throughout the book of the 12 that the minor prophets there, I mean, it's just heartbreak after heartbreak after heartbreak for God. And that's how he portrays himself, not this static, unchanging being. And throughout this, we're going to see, as me and Nate dive into that series, is there's so many if statements. If you will return to me, then this will happen. This blessing will come. And so there's not even, well, there's a conditionality built into God's actions and reactions as well that he himself expects and proposes. So I think it's just very interesting to see that the static God is not something that is portrayed in Scripture. It's a emotional, relational, reactive God. A consistently faithful to his covenant type of God, consistently rational God, but not a static rock.
Yeah. You're starting to see God really as a perfect person. Like, you're seeing God as a rational agent who has goals, who's trying to accomplish those goals, and then you can see yourself going, do I want to participate in some of those goals? Because this is what Israel's constantly being asked. Like, I've got this plan to bless all the nations. Are you guys in or out? You know, do you want to get in on this? And then what you have with Jesus is like, I'm establishing this new kingdom, you know, making good on all those past promises. Are you in? Are you out? And I'm not just commanding like a master to his servants. I'm telling you what the Father's plan is, so that way you know like what's going on here, because that's what friends do. And you're like, whoa, okay. So you're being invited into friendship with somebody who's a rational agent, and you can try to get in their head and understand, is this a person that's trustworthy? Is this really someone I want to be on their side? Do I want them on my side? You know, like, it's a very real life. Everything becomes very realistic now. Something that you could do encounter every day, and now you're going, okay, this applies to God.
Right, yeah, that's true. You don't have to take the Bible and learn philosophy to understand it. It's actually the prophets and apostles and so on, the authors, they are speaking in terms that you use every day intentionally, because they're communicating to, you know, there wasn't, we didn't have a systematic theology whenever the Bible was written. They were communicating in everyday language, not predefined special theological language. And so maybe we should take that at face value sometimes. So there is one more thing I want to ask you before we talk about time a little bit. And first of all, maybe this just goes to show how much more I need to swim in streams of theology proper. But I do really appreciate hearing this discussion, but also so many references back to the biblical story, the biblical theological overarching narrative. It's really cool. So what I would like to ask is, since you're kind of dissing on divine impassibility, clearly this has been just the default view forever, right? And so is that the case, or are there places in historical theology where, well, yeah, writers and thinkers have not always subscribed to divine impassibility, or to at least this unchangingness?
This is something I'm trying to reconstruct the history of, because the history we've been told is very selective, which is fine. Because
Yeah.
when you're a seminary student, you can't read everything. That's ridiculous. You got to read a lot of the greats, and that's fine. But when I'm looking at the history of Western ideas and some of the Eastern ideas, it's a lot more mixed than we're originally thinking. There are people like Peter of Ireland, who was one of Aquinas' childhood teachers. The reports on him are that he had to affirm that God was passible and mutable. Why? Because the incarnation pushed him to that. And so that's kind of interesting. When you're looking at a lot of objections that someone like Aquinas or John Duns Scotus or whomever are addressing, those are not questions out of nowhere. Those are questions that people are actually asking. Because because when you guys both went to seminary, right? Did you have to do a thesis defense?
Not
I
for
didn't
the input.
Okay, so when you do the PhD, you have to do like an oral defense, and for a while the practice was this is like Middle Ages. The practice was people, like everybody in the town could like come and watch you defend, and they could ask questions at a certain point, because there's no TV, there's no internet, so this is entertainment apparently, and people ask you questions. And then you write them down, and when you start giving your lectures, a lot of those questions that you got, those become like a question that you have in your lecture notes. So these questions are coming from someone, and there's a lot of questions going. This stuff conflicts with the Bible. It conflicts with like rationality. This is not coming from nowhere. They're coming from someone, and you start to see like the people they're kind of debating with. And at different points, you see the debates really kicking off a lot more intensely. During the Reformation, there's debates in England, debates in Italy, going like God's not like anything like these scholastic people are saying. And then right before the turn of the 20th century, there's this group of people in England and Ireland and Scotland who are just like, this is just nuts. Why are we even considering this stuff? That God's like completely impassible. And it kicks off this huge debate between mainly people in Scotland, England, a guy from Ohio, but he was in Indiana, and a guy in Germany. And this is about 100 years ago, to the day, actually. And this becomes this huge debate, again, of people going, impassibility's got to be false, passibility's got to be true. And then the way that 20th century theology goes is just this wide-scale rejection of impassibility.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay. Man, imagine giving your doctoral thesis. Your board is the entire town. Anybody wants to come out. That's intimidating.
It is.
But no, and I feel like, again, maybe it's just the tradition that I've been in, but it's typically you'll look back at maybe some recent people, but typically reformers, and then from there maybe back to Aquinas, and then from there selectively just those that have preceded those ideas, which, again, like you said, you can't expect everybody to read everything and to become an expert in everything. So it shouldn't necessarily feel responsible for that as an individual, but that's just kind of the case in the place that we're in. And so it's helpful to see that this wasn't just the singular idea and now we're the deviants. We are creating some sort of new doctrine. It's helpful to see that people, as far back as the New Testament's closing, were playing with these ideas.
Yes, and then you can go through like the rabbinic literature. Rabbinic literature is not really falling in the classical camp for quite some time. So there's a lot of history here, but again, you can't expect everybody to know all this because that's impossible. But it's something that a few small experts should figure out and try to communicate to the public.
Absolutely.